In the unforgiving dust of the Texas frontier, a woman's choices were few, and her chances were fewer. For Abigail, Finch widowed, and with her younger brother's life in her hands, desperation was a constant companion. Her last hope resided at the edge of civilization, at the homestead of a man who was more myth than mortal, a Comanche warrior turned rancher, a man feared by the settlers and disowned by his own people. When she knocked on his door, seeking any work, any chance at survival, she was met with a proposition that defied all reason and decency. He had no work for her. He had only one position available, the position of his wife. This is the story of that impossible bargain, and how a contract born of desperation became a war for survival, love, and a place to call home. The dust of Redemption Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that coated the soul as much as the skin. For Abigail Finch, it was the grit of despair. It had been 3 months since the fever took her husband William, and 2 months since the bank had taken their small failed farm back east. Now, with what little money she had, dwindling to nothing, and her 10-year-old brother Thomas growing thinner by the day, the dust felt like it was burying them alive. They had arrived in the raw-boned Texas town on the back of a freight wagon, drawn by promises of opportunity that had evaporated like morning mist under the brutal sun. There was no work for a respectable woman that didn't involve a saloon backroom, and Abigail would sooner starve. She had scrubbed floors, mended clothes, and taken in laundry until her knuckles were raw and her patron's charity ran dry. Now there was nothing left. Their room at the boarding house, a cramped, airless space that smelled of stale sweat and boiled cabbage, was paid for until sundown. After that, the street awaited. Thomas sat on the lumpy mattress, his small face pale and pinched with a hunger she could no longer ignore. He was trying to be brave, whittling a piece of scrap wood with a dull knife, but she saw the tremor in his hands. "Abigail," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm sorry I ate the biscuit so fast this morning." Her heart fractured. "Don't you dare be sorry, Thomas. There will be more. I promise." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her eyes fell on the small, worn Bible on the nightstand, its pages filled with promises of a merciful God who felt very far away. Mercy wasn't going to fill their bellies tonight. Action was needed. Drastic action. For weeks she had heard the whispers in town. Whispers about the man who lived 5 miles out on a sprawling ranch in the shadow of the mesas. They called him Blackwood, Kalin Blackwood. Some said he was a half-breed, others that he was a full-blooded Comanche who had somehow bought or stolen the land from the government. He was a phantom, a man who kept to himself, trading prime horses in town twice a year, but never staying for a drink or a word. He was rich, they said, and he was dangerous. The men in town spoke his name with a mixture of fear and derision. The women clutched their children closer if his shadow so much as fell across the street. He was the town's boogeyman, the ultimate outsider, and he was Abigail's last resort. Leaving Thomas with a stern warning not to open the door for anyone, she set out. The walk was grueling. The sun beat down, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Her worn-out boots offered little protection from the hot, rocky ground. The neat, sensible dress she had arrived in from Pennsylvania was now faded and frayed, a testament to her decline. By the time she saw the ranch, she was dizzy with heat and dehydration. It was not the savage camp she might have imagined. It was a proper homestead, stark and imposing, but well kept. A long, low adobe house stood solid against the horizon, flanked by a sturdy barn and a series of sprawling corrals. Within them moved some of the most magnificent horses she had ever seen, sleek, powerful animals that gleamed like polished obsidian in the sun. This was a place of wealth and substance, a fortress against the wildness of the land. Her resolve wavered. What was she thinking? A man like this would have no use for a scullery maid. He would laugh at her, or worse. But then the image of Thomas's hungry face flashed in her mind, and her feet carried her forward. She walked past the corrals, her presence causing the horses to stir and watch her with intelligent, wary eyes. A man was there, moving among them. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and black hair that fell past his shoulders, tied back with a simple leather cord. He wore settler's clothing, denim trousers, and a plain cotton shirt, but he moved with a fluid grace that seemed utterly alien to the stiff, clumsy gaits of the townsmen. He didn't seem to notice her. He was speaking to a fiery stallion, in a low, guttural murmur, a language she didn't recognize, his hand resting calmly on the animal's powerful neck. This had to be him. Kalin Blackwood. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she approached the house and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Her knuckles barely made a sound against the thick timber. She knocked again, louder this time. The murmuring in the corral stopped. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached from inside. The door swung open. He was even more intimidating up close. His face was all harsh angles and planes as if carved from the surrounding rock. His eyes, dark and piercing, held no warmth, only a guarded, analytical intelligence. They swept over her, taking in her worn dress, the dust on her face, the desperation she knew was plain to see. He said nothing. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat. "My name is Abigail Finch. I was told you might have work. I can cook, clean, mend, tend a garden. I'm a hard worker, I swear it. I don't need much, just a fair wage and a place to stay. For myself and my young brother." He continued to stare, his expression unreadable. The silence was a physical weight pressing down on her. She felt her hope fragile as it was begin to crumble. "Please, sir," she whispered the words catching in her throat. "We have nowhere else to go." Finally he spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder, devoid of any discernible accent, yet carrying a cadence she had never heard before. "I have no need of a cook. I feed myself. I have no need of a cleaner. The dust and I have an understanding." His gaze was so intense, it felt like he was seeing straight through her, laying bare every fear and failure. She flinched, ready to turn and flee, to accept her fate on the streets of Redemption Creek. However, he said the single word stopping her cold. "There is one position available at this ranch." A flicker of hope ignited within her. "Anything, sir. I'll do anything." His eyes narrowed slightly, a glint of something she couldn't decipher, cynicism perhaps, or even a grim sort of pity appearing in their depths. He leaned against the doorframe, a formidable, unmovable presence. "I have land, I have horses, and I have a house. The government men and the town council say a man with these things needs a wife to be seen as stable, to be seen as civilized. They use it as an excuse to question my claim to this deed." He paused, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "The only position available on this ranch, Mrs. Finch, is wife." Abigail stared at him, dumbfounded. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He couldn't be serious. This was a joke, a cruel, twisted taunt aimed at a desperate woman. But there was no humor in his face, no hint of a lie in his dark eyes. He was stating a fact, a business proposition. "Wife," she stammered the word, tasting like ash in her mouth. It would be a contract. He continued his tone, as flat and practical, as if he were discussing the price of feed. "You and your brother would have a roof over your heads. You would have food in your bellies, clothes on your backs. You would want for nothing material. Your brother would be safe here." He emphasized the last words, and Abigail knew he had seen her deepest fear. In return, he went on, "You would bear my name. You would be seen in town as my wife. You would run this household as you see fit. That is all." Her mind reeled. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. To marry this man, this stranger, this savage, as the town called him. It was unthinkable, a violation of everything she had been taught, of every moral fiber in her being. William had been dead only a few months. This would be a betrayal of his memory, a sacrilege. But then the alternative presented itself once more, Thomas shivering and hungry in some dark alley. Her brother, her responsibility, the only family she had left. Her promise to him echoed in her ears. There will be more. What was her pride worth against his life? What was the memory of a dead husband worth against the future of a living child? The choice was no choice at all. It was a condemnation. She looked past him, into the cool darkness of the house, and then back into his unyielding face. She was trading one form of destitution for another, selling her name and her future for simple survival. Her voice, when she found it, was a hollow whisper, the sound of a soul breaking. "I accept your terms." Kalin Blackwood's expression did not change, but a flicker of something surprise-respect passed through his eyes before being extinguished. He simply nodded once. "Go back to town," he said, his voice clipped and final. "Get your brother and your things. Be ready at dawn. The circuit judge passes through tomorrow. We will be married before noon." He stepped back and closed the door, plunging her back into the blinding, indifferent sun. The heavy thud of the latch echoed the closing of a door on her old life, and the locking of another on a future she could not possibly imagine. Dawn broke cold and grey, mirroring the landscape of Abigail's heart. She had spent the night in a daze, packing their few meagre belongings into a single carpet bag, while Thomas slept fitfully. She hadn't explained the full truth to him, only that she had found them work and lodging at a large ranch, and that they had to leave immediately. The relief on his small face was a fresh wound in her conscience. True to his word, Kalin Blackwood arrived as the first rays of sun crested the horizon. He wasn't in a fine carriage, but on the back of a sturdy wagon, pulled by two powerful draft horses. He didn't dismount. He simply sat there, a silent, brooding figure against the nascent light, waiting. He had brought a third horse, a gentle-looking mare tethered to the back. For her. The boarding-house owner, a sour-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, watched from the window, her mouth agape, as Abigail and Thomas emerged. The sight of the infamous Mr. Blackwood waiting for them sent a shock wave of gossip through the establishment before they had even cleared the porch. "Who is that man?" Abigail Thomas asked, his voice a mixture of awe and fear. "That is Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice tight. "He is our new employer." Kalin's eyes followed them as they approached. He gave Thomas a brief, assessing glance before his gaze settled on Abigail. He dismounted in one fluid motion and, without a word, lifted their bag and tossed it into the wagon bed. He then turned to Thomas. "You ride in the wagon," he stated, his voice not unkind, but firm. He lifted the boy up as if he weighed nothing. Then he turned to Abigail. "You ride the mare." He expected her to mount herself, but seeing her hesitate, a flicker of something like impatience crossed his face. He cupped his hands, a clear gesture. Mortified, but left with no choice, Abigail placed her booted foot into his grasp and let him lift her into the saddle. His touch was firm and impersonal, yet the brief contact sent a strange jolt through her. The ride to the judge's temporary office, a repurposed room in the town's only hotel, was conducted in absolute silence. People stopped and stared, Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. Abigail kept her eyes fixed forward, her back ramrod straight, feeling the burn of 100 pairs of eyes. She was a spectacle, the desperate widow selling herself to the Indian. Judge Morrison was a portly, balding man, with whiskey on his breath and impatience in his eyes. He looked from Kalin's stony face to Abigail's pale, drawn one, and back again, his brows furrowed in confusion and disapproval. Blackwood the judge grunted, foregoing any pleasantries. "You sure about this? And you, ma'am? You enter this union of your own free will." Abigail felt Kalin's gaze on her. It wasn't threatening, but it was heavy, expectant. "I do," she said, her voice thin but clear. The ceremony was a farce. It took less than 3 minutes. The judge mumbled the words from his book, barely looking up. There were no rings, no vows exchanged beyond a simple, "I will." When it was over, the judge signed the certificate with a flourish, pocketed the silver dollars Kalin placed on the desk, and promptly dismissed them. "You are now Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood," he announced, already reaching for his bottle. "May God have mercy on your souls." Outside, the air felt different, charged with an irrevocable finality. She was no longer Abigail Finch. She was Abigail Blackwood. The name felt alien on her tongue, a costume she was forced to wear. The journey back to the ranch was as silent as the one into town. When they arrived, Kalin led them back to the house. The interior was as stark as the exterior. The main room was large and sparsely furnished, with a long wooden table, a few chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves filled not with books or trinkets, but with neatly organized tools, leatherworking supplies, and dried herbs. It was clean, but utterly devoid of any personal comforting touches. It was a workspace, not a home. "Your room is there," he said, gesturing to a closed door. "The boys' is next to it. My room is at the other end of the house. The kitchen is through there. There is food in the pantry. Make this place your own. I have work to do." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her and Thomas standing in the middle of the silent room. The first few weeks were an exercise in coexistence, not partnership. They were two strangers orbiting each other in the quiet house. Kalin rose before the sun and worked until after it set. He tended to his horses with a devotion that was almost religious. His hands gentle, his voice a low murmur she could sometimes hear on the wind. He was a master of his craft. She could see that in the way the powerful half-wild animals trusted him implicitly. He ate the meals she prepared without comment, his face an unreadable mask. He never praised her cooking, but he never complained, and he always cleared his plate. He provided for them exactly as he had promised. The pantry was always stocked, and a small pile of coins appeared on the kitchen table every Monday morning for any other necessities. He spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and practical. Abigail, in turn, threw herself into her role. She scrubbed the floors until they shone, aired out the musty rooms, and battled the constant onslaught of dust. She found a small neglected garden plot behind the house, and began to till the soil planting seeds she bought in town with the coin he left her. She cooked, she mended, and she created a routine, a fragile bubble of domesticity in the vast, unnerving silence of the ranch. Her greatest challenge and greatest comfort was Thomas. The boy was wary of Kalin, at first hiding behind Abigail's skirts whenever the imposing man entered the house. But children are resilient. Thomas was fascinated by the horses, and he would spend hours sitting on the corral fence, watching Kalin work. One afternoon, Abigail watched from the kitchen window as Kalin gentled a young filly. Thomas, emboldened, had slipped off the fence and crept closer. The filly shied, and Kalin shot a sharp look at the boy. Abigail's heart leaped into her throat, expecting him to yell to send Thomas running. Instead, Kalin softened his stance. He said something to the horse, then turned to Thomas. He beckoned him closer. Hesitantly, Thomas approached. Kalin took the boy's small hand and gently placed it on the filly's nose, murmuring to both of them in that low, rhythmic language. A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, a genuine, unguarded smile that Abigail hadn't seen in months. From that day on, a quiet understanding began to grow between the man and the boy. Kalin would sometimes let Thomas help with small tasks, filling water troughs, brushing down a calm mare. He never spoke much to him, but he showed him things a silent form of instruction that Thomas seemed to understand perfectly. Yet with Abigail the wall remained. They slept in separate rooms, lived separate lives under the same roof. The house was large enough that they could go for hours without seeing each other. The nights were the worst. She would lie awake in her bed, a stiff, unfamiliar mattress in an unfamiliar room, and listen to the sounds of the wilderness outside, the howl of a coyote, the screech of an owl. The emptiness of the bed felt like an accusation. She was a wife in name, only a ghost in this man's house. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, the kind that shook the very foundations of the world. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning lit up the landscape in terrifying, brilliant flashes. Thomas, terrified of storms, since the night their father had been caught in one, came running into her room, sobbing. She was holding him, trying to soothe him when her door creaked open. Kalin stood there, silhouetted by a flash of lightning. He held a lantern in one hand. He didn't speak, just looked at the trembling boy in her arms. He's frightened of the thunder. She explained, her voice barely a whisper. Kalin nodded. He walked over to the bed and sat on the edge. He didn't look at Abigail, only at Thomas. "The thunder is the sky's heartbeat," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "And the lightning is the flash of its spirit. It is not anger. It is life. It makes the grass grow and the rivers run. There is nothing to fear." He reached out and placed a hand on Thomas's head. It was a gesture of such unexpected tenderness that it stole Abigail's breath. Thomas's sobs subsided into hiccups. He leaned into Kalin's touch, his fear slowly ebbing away. Kalin sat there for a long time, a silent, steady presence, until the storm passed, and the boy had fallen asleep. He then stood up, gave Abigail a single searching look, and left the room as quietly as he had entered. Lying in the dark, listening to the gentle sound of the receding rain, Abigail felt a profound shift within her. She had seen a glimpse of something beyond the contract, beyond the stoic rancher. She had seen a man capable of a deep, quiet kindness. It didn't change the fact that he was her keeper, not her husband, but it planted a seed of curiosity. Who was Kalin Blackwood, and what sorrows had carved that unreadable mask he wore for the world? For the first time, she began to wonder not about the man she had been forced to marry, but about the man who existed beneath the bargain. After a month on the ranch, their supplies ran low. The trip to Redemption Creek was unavoidable. Kalin announced it at breakfast, his tone as flat as ever. "We need flour and salt. The wagon is ready." It wasn't a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact. But the unspoken implication was clear. She and Thomas were coming with him. This was to be the first public display of their arrangement. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot. It was one thing to be Mrs. Blackwood in the isolation of the ranch, but another entirely to wear the name under the hostile gaze of the town. The ride was tense. Thomas, excited for a change of scenery, chatted happily, blissfully, unaware of the undercurrents. Abigail sat beside Kalin on the wagon bench, her hands clenched in her lap. She was acutely aware of the space between them, a chasm of silence and unspoken truths. He drove the wagon with an easy, confident hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. He seemed completely untroubled, a man at peace in the vast, open landscape. It was only as the dusty outlines of Redemption Creek came into view that she saw a subtle tension settle in his shoulders. He was not immune to the town's judgment. He was just better at hiding it. As they rolled down the main street, a hush fell over the town. Porch conversations ceased. The blacksmith's hammer stilled. Faces appeared in windows. Curtains were pulled back. Every eye was on them. On her. They saw her, the widow Finch, sitting beside the Comanche. The whispers started instantly, a sibilant tide of scorn and speculation. "Look there. Brazen as you please." Sold herself she did. For a roof over her head. Pity about her little brother. Growing up in that house? Abigail felt the heat rise in her cheeks. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but she forced herself to sit taller, to lift her chin, remembering the look in Kalin's eyes the day of the storm. She would not show these people her shame. She had made her choice to protect her brother, and she would stand by it. Kalin pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Henderson's general store. He dismounted and turned to help her down. His hand was firm on her elbow, a steadying presence. For a brief moment, she felt a flicker of gratitude. They were a united front, whether it was real or not. The moment they stepped inside the store, the air grew thick with hostility. The few customers inside fell silent, their eyes burning with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. Mr. Henderson, a wiry man with nervous eyes, polished the counter with a rag, refusing to meet their gaze. It was his wife, a kind-faced woman, named Beatrice Henderson, who finally broke the silence. She had shown Abigail small kindnesses in the past, slipping an extra apple into her bag when she thought no one was looking. "Abigail," she said, her voice a little too loud in the quiet room. "It's good to see you looking well," Beatrice Abigail replied, her voice strained. "We need some supplies." Before she could continue, the store's bell jingled, announcing a new arrival. Sheriff Brody Thompson filled the doorway, his bulk blocking out the sun. He was a big man who had gone to seed, his face florid and his gut straining the buttons of his uniform. He ruled Redemption Creek with a casual cruelty, his authority unquestioned. His eyes, small and porcine, swept the room and landed on Kalin and Abigail. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. Well, he drawled, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "Look what we have here. The happy couple." Kalin's posture didn't change, but Abigail felt the atmosphere shift, growing colder, more dangerous. He stood utterly still, his presence radiating a coiled intensity. Sheriff Thompson ignored him, focusing his sneer on Abigail. "I must say, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, drawing out the name like an insult, "you've landed on your feet." Quite a step up from taking in laundry. Abigail's face burned with humiliation. "We're just here for supplies, Sheriff." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Thompson chuckled. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. His breath smelled of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "But a word of advice. Some folks in this town don't take kindly to unnatural arrangements. You'd do well to remember your place." Suddenly Kalin moved. It wasn't a large movement, just a slight shift of his weight, but it was enough to place him squarely between Abigail and the sheriff. He still hadn't said a word, but his message was unmistakable. His eyes, dark and flat, locked onto Thompson's. The sheriff's bravado faltered for a second. He was a bully who preyed on the weak, and he knew instinctively that Kalin was not weak, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of an audience. "You got something to say?" Blackwood Thompson blustered his hand, dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. The silence in the store was absolute. Thomas, who had been looking at candy jars, shrank back against Abigail's legs. Kalin's voice, when it came, was dangerously low and quiet. "She is my wife. Her place is with me. If you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply stated a fact, and in his quiet intensity, it carried more weight than any shouted challenge. Thompson's face flushed a deep mottled red. He was being challenged in public, and by a man he considered his inferior. For a tense moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. The sheriff's hand twitched, but Kalin didn't move. He just watched, waited. He was a predator patient and utterly confident. It was Thompson who broke first. With a final hateful glare, he spat on the floorboards. "This ain't over," he snarled before turning on his heel and storming out of the store. The tension in the room broke, but the hostility remained, now mingled with a grudging fear. Abigail's legs felt weak, and she leaned back against the counter for support. Kalin turned and began listing their needs to Mr. Henderson in a calm, even voice, as if nothing had happened. As they gathered their things, Beatrice Henderson came around the counter. She pressed a small bag of peppermint sticks into Thomas's hand. "For you, sweetie," she whispered. Then she looked at Abigail, her eyes full of a worried sympathy. "You be careful, Abigail. Sheriff Thompson is a vindictive man. He doesn't forget a slight." "Thank you, Beatrice," Abigail managed to say. On the ride home, the silence was different. It was no longer just an absence of words, but a space filled with the echoes of the confrontation. Abigail kept replaying the scene in her mind. Kalin had defended her, not as part of a contract, not as a business arrangement, but as a man defending his wife. "She is my wife. Her place is with me." The words resonated deep within her. He had drawn a line in the sand, not just for the sheriff, but for the entire town, and he had placed her firmly on his side of it. As the ranch came into view, she found the courage to speak. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet. In the store, Kalin kept his eyes on the road. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't reply. "He dishonored you," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "That dishonors my house. It will not happen again." It was not the romantic declaration a real wife might have hoped for. It was a statement of ownership of territory. And yet, it was more than she expected. It was a shield. In that moment, she realized that the bargain she had made was not just for food and shelter. In marrying Kalin Blackwood, she had perhaps, unwittingly, acquired a protector. A dangerous, silent man who had just declared to the world that she belonged to him. And in the face of the hatred in Redemption Creek that felt less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. The confrontation in town marked a subtle but significant shift in the rhythm of their lives. The wall of silence between Abigail and Kalin remained, but it now seemed to have a few small chinks in it. He began to speak to her more often, though his words were still sparse and practical. He would comment on the weather, on the condition of a particular horse, or ask if she needed more wood for the stove. Small things, but they were the foundations of a bridge across the chasm that separated them. Abigail, for her part, found herself watching him more closely, her curiosity growing. She saw the way his hand, so strong and capable, could be incredibly gentle when treating an injured foal. She saw the quiet respect he showed the land, never taking more than he needed, his movements in nature as seamless as a wolf's. He was a man of deep, ingrained discipline and a quiet, profound connection to the world around him. The change was most evident in Thomas. The boy now shadowed Kalin whenever he could, his initial fear completely replaced by hero worship. Kalin never overtly encouraged it, but he never pushed him away either. He answered the boy's endless questions with patience, explaining the names of the wild plants, showing him how to track a jackrabbit, and teaching him the silent language of the horses. One evening, Abigail was mending one of Thomas's shirts by the fire when the boy came and sat at her feet, his face glowing with excitement. "Kalin is teaching me how to make a bow," he exclaimed. "A real one. He says I have a good eye." "Is he now?" Abigail smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "You be sure to listen to everything he says. It is a great skill." "He told me a story," Thomas said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "about how the first Comanche warrior got his bow from the spirit eagle." Abigail paused her sewing. Kalin had told him a story from his people. This was more than just instruction. It was a sharing of his heritage, a piece of himself he was entrusting to her brother. Later that night, long after Thomas was asleep, a sudden violent cough echoed from Kalin's end of the house. It was a deep, ragged sound that tore through the quiet. It was followed by another and another. Alarmed, Abigail lit a lamp and hesitated outside her door. Men like Kalin didn't get sick. They were forces of nature, as indomitable as the mesas. But the coughing continued, punctuated by what sounded like a pained gasp. Tossing aside propriety, she walked the length of the hall and knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Blackwood, Kalin. Are you all right?" A muffled groan was the only reply. She pushed the door open. The room was dark, save for the moonlight filtering through the window. Kalin was on his bed, curled on his side, his body racked with shivers despite the warm night. She rushed to his side, placing a hand on his forehead. He was burning with fever. "You're ill," she stated, a wave of panic and a strange, unfamiliar protectiveness washing over her. He tried to sit up, his pride warring with the sickness. "It is nothing." A passing chill. His voice was a raw, broken whisper. Another fit of coughing seized him, leaving him breathless and slumped against the pillows. "It is not nothing," she said, her tone firm, surprising even herself. "You lie still." For the next 2 days, Abigail became a nurse. She drew on the knowledge her mother had passed down, memories of poultices and herbal remedies she thought she had long forgotten. She brewed willow bark tea to bring down the fever and made a strong, clear broth to give him strength. She kept cool cloths on his forehead and sat by his bed through the long nights, listening to his fevered, troubled breathing. In his delirium, the cracks in his armor widened into gaping fissures. He mumbled in the language she didn't understand his words, sharp and pained. But sometimes he spoke in English, fragmented phrases that offered glimpses into the well of his past. "Gone. All gone. Fire and smoke," he whispered once, his hands clenching the blankets. "They promised. A piece of paper is not a shield." Another time, his eyes flew open wide with a remembered horror. "Sarah, run," he cried out, his voice raw with anguish. He seemed to look right through Abigail, seeing a ghost in her place. The name hung in the air between them. Sarah, a wife, a sister. The pain in his voice when he spoke the name was a fresh, unhealed wound. Abigail felt a pang of something she couldn't name, jealousy, sorrow, a deep and aching empathy for this man whose history was a closed book. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. Kalin woke up, his mind clear, but his body weak. He found Abigail asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped at an awkward angle, a damp cloth still clutched in her hand. He watched her for a long time, taking in the exhausted lines on her face. She had not left his side. She had cared for him with a fierce, unwavering dedication. This was not part of their contract. There was no clause about nursing him through sickness, about sitting vigil through his fevered nightmares. She had done it because she chose to. When she finally stirred and opened her eyes, she found him watching her. His dark eyes, clear and lucid. "You should have rested," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "And let you die of fever." She countered, her voice soft. Thomas would miss his bow-making lessons. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression that transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, more vulnerable. "The broth," he said. It was good. It was the first compliment he had ever given her. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. As he regained his strength over the next few days, the house felt different. The space between them had shrunk. The formal Mr. Blackwood was gone from her vocabulary, replaced by a tentative Kalin. He in turn began to seek her out, not just for meals, but for conversation. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he finally offered her a piece of his story. "My father was a white trader," he began, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "My mother was Comanche. They lived between worlds belonging to neither. When I was 16, a band of ex-soldiers drunk on whiskey and prejudice came to our camp. They said my father had cheated them. It was a lie. They wanted an excuse." He paused, the silence stretching out heavy with memory. Abigail weighted her heart, aching for the boy he had been. They burned everything he said, his voice flat devoid of emotion, which was somehow more terrible than if he had wept. "My parents, my younger sister, Sarah, they were all killed. I was hunting. I came back to nothing but smoke. The soldiers were gone. So that was the ghost he saw in his fever. His sister. The family he had lost. I tracked them for 3 days," he continued, his voice turning hard as flint. "Justice was not something the law offered my people. So I took my own." He didn't need to elaborate. Abigail understood. This land, this was my mother's. Her people lived here for generations. My father used his name to file a claim on it, to protect it with a white man's paper. It was all I had left of them. He fell silent, and Abigail said nothing, knowing that no words could possibly touch the depth of his grief. Instead, she reached out, and for the first time placed her hand on his. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His skin was rough and calloused, but his touch was warm and steady. They sat there in silence as the last light faded from the sky, their hands clasped together. It was no longer a contract. It was a connection forged in sickness and sorrow, a fragile trust beginning to take root in the hard, unforgiving soil of their lives. The fragile peace they had built was not destined to last. News of Kalin's illness had somehow reached town, likely through a passing rider who had noticed the lack of activity on the ranch. To Sheriff Thompson, this was a sign of weakness, an opportunity to be exploited. He had been humiliated in the general store, and his festering resentment now had an outlet. He couldn't attack Kalin directly. Blackwood was a landowner with a legal claim, and despite the prejudice against him, a direct assault would bring too much scrutiny. So he decided to attack the foundation of Kalin's new life, his family. It happened on a bright, clear afternoon. Thomas was down by the creek that bordered their property, a place he loved to fish with the simple pole Kalin had made for him. Abigail was in her garden, humming softly to herself as she pulled weeds. Kalin was in the far pasture, working with a new stallion. The scene was one of tranquil domesticity. The tranquility was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. It wasn't just one rider, but 3. Abigail straightened up, shielding her eyes against the sun. She saw Sheriff Thompson and 2 of his deputies riding hard toward the house. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. They bypassed the house, heading straight for the creek. Thomas Abigail screamed, dropping her trowel and running her skirts flying behind her. She was fast, but the horses were faster. By the time she reached the creek, they had him. One of the deputies, a lanky man with a cruel face named Cletus, had Thomas by the arm, lifting him from the ground. Her brother was crying, his fishing pole lying broken on the bank. "What is the meaning of this?" Abigail demanded, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "Let him go." Sheriff Thompson dismounted, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Now, Mrs. Blackwood, no need to get hysterical. We're just performing our civic duty." "What duty? He's a child. He's done nothing wrong. That's where you're mistaken," Thompson said, pulling a small silver locket from his pocket. It was ornate and clearly expensive. This was reported stolen from the mayor's wife 2 days ago. "Cletus here just found it in your boy's pocket." Abigail stared in disbelief. "That's impossible. He hasn't been to town in weeks." "You planted that on him." "A serious accusation," Thompson sneered. "The boy's a thief. Probably learned his thieving ways from that savage you married." "He's coming with us. The judge will see him in the morning." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. They were taking Thomas. They were going to lock him up, accuse him, and there was nothing she could do. She lunged for her brother, but the second deputy blocked her path, shoving her roughly back. It was then that Kalin arrived. He didn't ride in like a storm. He appeared at the edge of the trees, silent, as a ghost mounted on the black stallion he'd been training. The horse was wild-eyed and powerful, sensing its rider's cold fury. Kalin's face was a mask of death. His eyes were not angry. They were void of all emotion, which was far more terrifying. They were fixed on the deputy holding Thomas. "Let the boy go," Kalin said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air like a razor. Thompson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You've got no authority here, Blackwood. This is official town business. Your thieving little whelp is under arrest." Kalin slid from the stallion's back. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was mesmerizing and deadly. "I will say it one more time. Let him go." Cletus, emboldened by the sheriff's presence, tightened his grip on Thomas, making the boy cry out in pain. That was the final mistake. In a blur of motion, too fast to follow, Kalin closed the distance. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need one. He slammed into Cletus, his hand striking the deputy's wrist with a sickening crack. Cletus screamed, and his hand flew open. Kalin caught Thomas with his other arm, swinging the boy behind him and into Abigail's waiting arms. Before the other two could react, Kalin spun his leg, sweeping out, knocking the second deputy off his feet. Thompson, his face a mask of shock and rage, fumbled for his pistol. He was too slow. Kalin seized the sheriff's gun hand, twisting it until Thompson cried out, and the pistol dropped to the dirt. With a powerful shove, he sent the sheriff stumbling back into the creek. The entire confrontation had taken less than 5 seconds. Kalin now stood between his family and the 3 lawmen, a formidable, unassailable wall. The 2 deputies were nursing their injuries, and Sheriff Thompson was sputtering in the shallow water, his dignity as soaked as his trousers. "This is my land," Kalin said, his voice a low, lethal growl. "This is my family. You are trespassing. You have assaulted a child. Get off my property. Now." Thompson scrambled to his feet, his face purple with fury. "You just assaulted officers of the law. Blackwood, I'll see you hang for this." "You will see nothing." Kalin countered, his eyes blazing. "You came here without a warrant. You planted evidence on a child. You laid hands on my wife. There are laws even for men like you. And if you ever come near my family again, the law will be the least of your concerns. That is not a threat. It is a promise." He bent down and picked up Thompson's fallen pistol, expertly emptying the chambers and tossing the useless weapon into the mud. He did the same with the deputies' guns, which were still in their holsters. Disarmed and utterly humiliated, the three men had no choice. They gathered their horses, their eyes spitting hatred and fear, and rode away. Sheriff Thompson's final, shouted promise to bring back a posse and burn the ranch to the ground was lost on the wind. The moment they were gone, Kalin's rigid posture dissolved. He turned his face, etched with a concern that was raw and real. He knelt in front of Thomas, who was still sobbing in Abigail's arms. "Are you hurt?" Kalin asked, his hands gently checking the boy's arm. Thomas shook his head, burying his face in Kalin's shoulder. "I was scared," he mumbled. "I know," Kalin said, his voice rough with emotion, as he held the boy tight. "You are safe now. I will not let anyone harm you." He held him for a long moment before looking up at Abigail. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything. The fury, the fear, the fierce, unconditional protectiveness. He wasn't defending his house or his name. He was defending his son. He was defending his wife. "He is not my employer," Abigail thought with a sudden, startling clarity. "He is not just my protector. He is my husband." The word which had once been a source of shame now bloomed in her chest with a fierce, possessive pride. The sheriff's gambit had failed spectacularly. He had meant to tear them apart, to expose their arrangement as a sham. Instead, he had forged them into something real, something unbreakable. He had turned a bargain into a family, and in doing so he had sealed his own fate. For he had not just made an enemy of Kalin Blackwood, he had made an enemy of his wife. And Abigail was no longer the desperate, frightened woman who had knocked on a stranger's door. She was a woman with everything to lose, and she would fight for it with every fiber of her being. They knew Thompson would not let the humiliation stand. That night, Kalin laid out a desperate plan. While he stayed to defend their home, Abigail would ride for the U.S. Marshal in Austin, 4 days away. "Thompson wants me," Kalin stated, pressing a sealed letter for Marshal Vance into her hand. "He will not expect you to be gone." Before dawn, he had her ready on the fastest mare. "You have the heart of a survivor," he said, his hands firm on her shoulders. "Now you must have the heart of a warrior." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers for a powerful, silent moment, before she galloped into the darkness, never looking back. After she was gone, Kalin secured Thomas in a hidden cellar, making the boy promise to stay hidden until he returned. The posse arrived mid-morning, with Sheriff Thompson bellowing for Kalin's surrender. The answer came not from the house, but from the rocks above. Kalin's rifle cracked, disarming one of the men. He fought like a ghost, using the terrain to his advantage, his shots precise and disabling. The posse's bravado quickly melted into the fear of an unseen enemy they could not fight. Enraged and losing control, Thompson himself hurled a torch through the front window. As smoke and flames began to pour from the house, Kalin knew he had to end it. The fire was a tragedy, but it was also a distraction. He slipped away from the rocks, circling behind the posse as they stared at the blaze. He moved like a phantom through the chaos, taking down the panicked men with the silent, efficient force of a true warrior. The last man standing was Sheriff Thompson, who watched the house burn with a look of manic triumph. That look vanished when he felt the cold press of a rifle barrel against the back of his neck. "It's over, Thompson." Kalin's voice was a low growl of thunder. The reckoning had arrived. 4 days later, Abigail returned with Marshal Elias Vance and his deputies. Cresting the rise, she saw the blackened, smouldering shell of their house, and her heart seized with terror. But then a figure emerged from the barn, Kalin soot-stained, but alive. Behind him, Thomas ran towards her, and she leaped from her horse, catching him in a desperate, tearful embrace. She turned to Kalin, words failing her, as she took in the bandage on his arm and the exhaustion in his eyes. "Thomas is safe," he said, his voice raspy. "The house is gone. But we are here." Marshal Vance's experienced eyes surveyed the scene of battle. After hearing Kalin's quiet, factual account, he swiftly dismantled the posse's blustering lies. The final proof was the silver locket, which a deputy found tucked away in Sheriff Thompson's own saddlebag. Brodie Thompson, the marshal, declared, his voice ringing with finality. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, abuse of authority, and attempted murder." With the disgraced lawman and his men in custody, Vance gave Kalin a nod of respect. "Your deed is solid, Blackwood. The town will learn to leave you be." He tipped his hat to Abigail. "Ma'am, you're a credit to the frontier spirit." Then he and his men were gone, leaving them in the sudden quiet. They stood alone amid the devastation. "It's all gone," Abigail whispered, the loss settling upon her. Kalin took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "Not all," he said, his voice a steady anchor. "The land is still here. The sky is still here." He looked from their joined hands to her eyes. "We are still here." In that moment, Abigail knew home wasn't a structure of wood and mud. It was the unbreakable bond between the three of them, a family forged in fire. They began rebuilding, and as the walls of their new home rose, so did a deep and quiet love. The work was hard, but their shared labor became a language of its own, replacing the silence that had once defined them. One evening, watching the sunset paint the sky, Kalin turned to her. "Abigail," he said, his voice full of a new warmth. "When I made my offer, it was a bargain to protect my land." "I know," she replied softly. "And for me, it was a bargain to protect my brother." "It is no longer a bargain," he said, his dark eyes searching hers. "This is your home by right. You are my wife, not in name, but in my heart." Tears of joy welled in her eyes. "And you are my husband," she whispered. He leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss of promises fulfilled, and a future earned tasting of wood smoke dust, and the undeniable feeling of home. The position of wife had been filled not by a hired hand, but by a partner, a warrior, and the undeniable heart of their new world. And so, a story that began with a desperate knock on a door became a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. Abigail and Kalin, two souls from different worlds, forged a life not from a contract, but from courage, respect, and a love that defied all expectations. Their journey reminds us that family isn't always something you are born into. Sometimes it's something you build, defend, and fight for amidst the ashes of the old world. They proved that a home is not just four walls, but the safety you find in another's arms, and that love can bloom in the most barren and unlikely of landscapes. If their incredible story of survival and love on the unforgiving frontier moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true grit. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories from the Wild West that history almost forgot. Click that bell icon so you never miss an adventure into the past. Thank you for listening.